Hello and thanks for joining us for our mid-morning edition of Arirang News. I'm Mark Broom. Let's start by taking a look at the day's headlines. The big day is here for hundreds of thousands of high school seniors in South Korea. All those hours studying have been for this moment, the annual college entrance exam. We go live to a test centre in Seoul. North Korea diplomacy in Singapore. President Moon Jae-in is set to meet US Vice President Mike Pence on the sidelines of the ASEAN Summit. Efforts to denuclearize the North are expected to dominate their discussions. Plus, South Korea's financial regulator says Samsung BioLogics purposely broke accounting laws ahead of its 2016 IPO. The decision could see the Samsung affiliate booted off the local stock market. So let's start with one of the key dates, if not the key date on South Korea's education calendar. The College Scholastic Ability Test Day comes but once a year. It is the most important day of their young lives, something these high school seniors have been squarely focusing their attention on for many years. Today, over 594,000 of them all across South Korea are taking their sunung, as it's known here. For more, let's connect to our Yoon Jung-min, who is at one of the test sites. So Jung-min, just tell us where you are and how's it going there?
Right, Mark. Currently, I am standing in front of Seoul High School, one of the hundreds of test sites where today's sunung is taking place. The students have just finished their first exam, which was Korean language. Well, as you touched upon, today, nearly 600,000 students, mostly high school seniors, are taking the College Scholastic Ability Test, or CSAT, at 1,190 test sites nationwide. The exams begin at 8:40 a.m., around an hour and 20 minutes ago. And the students will take mathematics, English, Korean history, and more tests later on. This year, the Education Ministry is allowing students to wear face masks during the test due to the unhealthy levels of fine dust. At a briefing an hour ago, the Education Ministry said this year's test is focused on basic and key elements in the high school curriculum. These exams are so important as students spend years studying day and night for them, and the results determine which universities they will go to next year. Koreans believe a college shapes a student's future, so many of them study around the clock with little sleep to get into the best college possible. So it's no wonder that the whole country gets behind the test takers. Today, workers in the public sector and a lot in the private sector started work an hour later than usual at 10 a.m. just a few minutes ago to ensure traffic on the roads was light and the test takers could arrive on time. The country's stock markets also opened and will close an hour later than normal too. More subway trains and buses were in operation, and police officers on motorbikes were on hand to rush students to test centers if they are running late. From 1 p.m., even flights will be put on hold for about 30 minutes during English listening comprehension section to minimize disturbance. Traffic near the test sites is being controlled as well. Also, for the big day, groups of juniors gathered outside the test sites to cheer on their seniors. They are all gone now, but they were here to encourage their seniors and wish them good luck. Plus, they might come back when the test is about to finish. Well, that's all I have for now, but I'll bring more updates for our next newscasts. Mark?
Well, thank you very much, Jung-min, for that comprehensive report. You really get an idea now of the importance of the sunung test for young high school students here in Korea. And I know they're not watching because they're doing the test, but best of luck to them if you're watching this back on video on demand or something. Now, we are going to take a look at the rest of the day's news now. On the sidelines of ASEAN-related meetings in Singapore, President Moon Jae-in is sitting down with leaders from not only Asia, but around the world. In a little over 1 hour from now, President Moon is set for talks with US Vice President Mike Pence. Our Shin Se-min, who is traveling with President Moon, files his report from Singapore.
On day 3 of his stay in Singapore, President Moon Jae-in is to sit down with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence on the sidelines of the ongoing ASEAN-related summits. The main topic of their conversation, North Korea.
President Moon, attending the ASEAN-related summit meetings, will hold talks with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence on Thursday morning. They will discuss measures to denuclearize the Korean peninsula, as well as ways to build on our bilateral relations.
It's being viewed as the most important of President Moon's upcoming sideline meetings, as these are the first high-level face-to-face talks between South Korea and the U.S. since the postponement of talks last week between U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and his North Korean counterpart Kim Jong-un. The direction of the process hangs in the balance, as Pence recently wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post saying the U.S. has no intention of letting up on its unprecedented diplomatic and economic pressure on the regime. Earlier, President Moon also held talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday, where the two discussed easing sanctions on North Korea. President Moon said there has to be substantial progress on denuclearization and the peace process ahead of a scheduled visit to Seoul by North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. On the possibility of Kim visiting Russia, South Korea's presidential spokesperson, quoting Putin, said Kim is interested and relevant discussions between Pyongyang and Moscow are underway. President Moon and Chinese President Xi Jinping are also scheduled to hold talks this week in Papua New Guinea on the sidelines of the annual APEC summit. From Putin to Pence and Xi, President Moon has lined up big summit meetings with key players in North Korea diplomacy. The discussion with Vice President Mike Pence is likely to include talks on how to move forward with North Korea in view of the results of U.S. midterm elections. Shin Se-min, Arirang News, Singapore.
Now we're going to stay in Singapore. President Moon Jae-in has told Asian leaders in the city-state that he's open to inviting the North Korean leader to a special Korea-ASEAN Summit in Seoul in 2019. He also stressed the importance of ongoing cooperation between Seoul and Southeast Asian nations. Kan Hyung-woo reports.
President Moon Jae-in says he will actively review the possibility of inviting North Korea's Kim Jong-un to a special Korea-ASEAN Summit to be held next year in South Korea. The idea of inviting Kim was proposed by another Asian leader.
Indonesian President Joko Widodo proposed Kim Jong-un be invited to the special Korea-ASEAN Summit in 2019, saying the summit would be all the more significant with the leaders of both Koreas in attendance.
And that, President Moon said, was a, quote, noteworthy suggestion. He says Seoul will closely consult with ASEAN nations in advance of what would be the third ASEAN summit to be held in South Korea. During Wednesday's summit in Singapore, President Moon pitched his plans to boost cooperation, seen as the basis of his new Southern policy, which includes a special Korea-ASEAN Summit next year in Seoul and setting up a Korea-Mekong Summit. President Moon's policy calls for stronger economic ties between South Korea and the 10 ASEAN nations, a policy that has already produced tangible results in terms of trade volume and people-to-people exchanges.
한 아세안의 관계가 한 차원 더 높아질 것입니다. 아세안의 하나된 힘으로 아시아의 평화와 번영이 앞당겨지길 희망합니다.
President Moon also shared the progress made on the Korean Peninsula and expressed appreciation to ASEAN leaders for their support in backing Seoul's efforts to establish lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. Kan Hyung-woo, Arirang News.
South Korea's financial regulator says Samsung BioLogics, the biopharmaceutical arm of Samsung Group, purposely broke accounting rules ahead of its IPO a couple of years ago. Trading on the firm's shares were immediately suspended on Wednesday, and Samsung BioLogics could end up actually getting kicked off the benchmark Kospi for good. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
Korea's Securities and Futures Commission said Wednesday it found that Samsung BioLogics had intentionally inflated its value by nearly $4 billion in 2015. It says the company had deliberately applied different accounting standards against regulations by changing the way it estimated how much its majority stake in Samsung Bioepis, its partner, was worth.
Samsung has deliberately changed accounting standards back in 2015 to justify its management control. We have concluded that this was done intentionally, violating regulations.
Samsung BioLogics had denied any wrongdoing, saying it reflected different accounting standards in the event its unlisted joint venture Samsung BioEpis exercised its call option. But the financial regulator argued Samsung BioLogics had no legitimate reason to suddenly change the status of Samsung BioEpis from a subsidiary company into an affiliated company, allowing Samsung BioLogics to customize its books to 18 times of its partner's initial value. The move is also suspected of committing an accounting fraud in the merger process of Samsung C&T Corporation and Tail Industries in 2015 in favor of Samsung Electronics vice chairman and the group's apparent heir, Lee Jae-yong, the biggest shareholder of Samsung C&T. With this, the financial regulator says it plans to bring a lawsuit against Samsung BioLogics. It has already imposed a fine of more than $7 million and advised the company to dismiss its CEO. Samsung BioLogics said it'll file for an administrative litigation, which could take 7 to 8 years in total to settle the dispute, taking into consideration the motion to appeal is exercised in lower courts. Meanwhile, the verdict is expected to affect some 80,000 minority shareholders. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
A Chinese online travel agency recently resumed offering group tour packages to South Korea, but in a remarkable U-turn, it suddenly cancelled them after attention was drawn to the agency in question. Watchers say it appears Chinese travel agencies are being extremely cautious on when to resume sales after Beijing's ban on all group tours to South Korea early last year. Kim Hyo-sun tells us more.
China's largest online travel agency suddenly removed group tour packages to South Korea from its website on Wednesday. While Ctrip resumed group tours to Korea after the Chinese government placed a ban on all group tours to South Korea in March last year over the installation of a U.S. missile defense system, it deleted them after South Korean media reported on the resumption. Earlier, another Chinese travel agency also delisted group tour packages to Korea from its website following media coverage in South Korea. In November last year, China lifted the ban on over-the-counter sales of package tours from Beijing and Shandong to South Korea, but it kept online curbs in place. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
The United States has been firm on the need to continue implementing sanctions on North Korea to get it to denuclearize. Washington is crystal clear about what it expects from China, but a bipartisan congressional panel has concluded that Beijing is not doing nearly enough to keep maximum pressure on the regime in Pyongyang. Lee Seung-jae reports.
Releasing its annual report on Wednesday, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission noted that China appears to have already started to loosen enforcement of sanctions on the regime. This comes despite Beijing recently agreeing to additional UN Security Council sanctions. The report said that when China enforced sanctions more thoroughly in the past, it led to a significant decrease in North Korean exports to China. However, the Commission says China's enforcement measures still have holes, including the use of ship-to-ship crude oil transfers. It added Beijing always leaves key lifelines in place for North Korea, most notably oil exports, which it believes averts a complete regime collapse. The report comes as tensions have spiked between the world's two largest economies over trade and tariffs issues. Established in 2000, the Commission has reported on China's economic and military rise, including recommendations for counteractions such as trade sanctions. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
3 South Korean petroleum and refinery companies have pled guilty to criminal charges and agreed to pay a total of $236 million for their involvement in a bid rigging scheme to supply U.S. military bases here in South Korea. According to the U.S. Department of Justice on Wednesday, 3 companies, SK Energy, GS Caltex and Hanjin Transportation, are accused of involvement in a conspiracy to suppress competition during the bidding process for fuel contracts from 2005 to 2016. The Justice Department said the settlement is part of a larger investigation involving other companies. Andy Kim, a Democrat who has never held political office before, has defeated two-term Republican Representative Tom MacArthur in New Jersey's 3rd Congressional District. He will become the first Korean American to ever represent New Jersey in Congress when he's sworn in January. He'll also be the first Korean American to serve in Congress in 2 decades. Kim was a national security official during the former Obama administration after earning a PhD in international relations at Oxford University. Now, from startups to corporate giants, many are joining the race to use blockchain technology, a decentralized peer-to-peer system that enables online transactions. For an expert's analysis of the industry and how Korean companies can make use of it, our Kim Hae-sung had the opportunity to sit down with Alex Tapscott. He is an investor in blockchain startups, the co-author of the best-selling book Blockchain Revolution, and founder of the Blockchain Research Institute. So he knows his stuff. Let's take a look.
Blockchain, along with AI, Internet of Things, and robotics, is considered one of the core technologies of the 4th Industrial Revolution. Why is that?
So what blockchain represents is a new evolution of the internet. So for the first time in human history, we have a native digital medium for value that allows individuals, businesses, and other institutions to move and store and manage assets peer-to-peer, in the same way that the internet allowed us to move and store information peer-to-peer. And that obviously represents transformational capability for the economy. If you think about certain industries like financial services, still rely mostly on intermediaries, middlemen like banks, to sit in the middle and establish trust and verify identity and enable the movement of value. And now we have a way to replace that.
The Korean government and business circles are also trying to use blockchain technology in various areas like the voting system, logistics, and retail. Where do you see blockchain become the biggest driving force here in Korea?
Well, I think, financial services. I think that Koreans could reinvent banking and use it as a new platform to access customers outside of Korea and also to broaden the services inside of Korea. Telecommunications. If you look at the manufacturing and industrial sectors, Korea is a huge industrial powerhouse. There are big companies like Samsung, LG, and others. I think that they could revolutionize their supply chains with blockchain.
What are some challenges that blockchain technology needs to overcome so that more companies can use the technology and really create disruptions across sectors?
Well, there are at least 10 different challenges. And there's so many, actually, that we dedicated a whole chapter in the book, Blockchain Revolution, to addressing each of these. I would say the biggest ones today are, number one, is the technology scalable to meet the demands of big companies and institutions? Number two is how incumbents will react. What will existing companies do to stop or to prevent this from growing? And then the third one, of course, is governments and regulations. How do we create new rules or new policies to address the rate of change of innovation?
Any advice on the regulation front for the government?
Well, my only advice is that appreciate that as a government, you have a lot of information, but you may not have all the information. And you have to work with other stakeholders. And they should consider working very closely with industry to create the new regulations. The biggest issue today is we're not a token, is a security, a stock. And I think in some cases that's true, and in other cases it isn't. And figuring out which one is which and how to regulate it is very, very important.
Alex Tapscott, founder of Blockchain Research Institute, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So it's time for our Around the World segment, and we start with the big news out of London. British Prime Minister Theresa May says her cabinet has decided to support a draft EU divorce deal, a Brexit deal. For more on this and other news from around the world, let's turn to our Noah Adam. Adam, so Prime Minister May has passed what is likely to be the first of many hurdles.
That's right, Mark. It was a tough hurdle at that to overcome, as our senior ministers were quite divided over Brexit. Wednesday's meeting took about 5 hours, so a bit longer than they wanted. After the talks, May stood outside 10 Downing Street and told the public the near 600-page draft deal was the best that could be negotiated.
This is a decisive step which enables us to move on and finalise the deal in the days ahead. These decisions were not taken lightly, but I believe it is a decision that is firmly in the national interest.
Now, the Prime Minister faces yet a much tougher challenge, which is to get the draft approved in British Parliament. Many MPs have already expressed their willingness to vote it down. May acknowledge she faces a bumpy road ahead.
I know that there will be difficult days ahead. This is a decision which will come under intense scrutiny, and that is entirely as it should be and entirely understandable.
There had also been reports that a few cabinet ministers would resign, but it's not yet clear if that will happen. No announcements have been made yet. Shortly after May's comments, the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, called the draft agreement a decisive and crucial step. Other EU leaders, meanwhile, will decide amongst themselves if the deal works for them. In other news, France has lashed out at US President Donald Trump over a series of Tuesday tweets in which he mocked his French counterpart. Trump criticised Emmanuel Macron and his government over trade, the French leader's warnings about nationalism, plans for a European army, the country's wine industry, as well as Macron's approval ratings. The barrage of tweets came as France marked the third anniversary of the Bataclan terrorist attacks, which left 130 people dead. The following day, Macron's spokesman had this to say.
Yesterday was November 13th. We were commemorating the assassination of 130 of our compatriots 3 years ago in Paris and Saint Denis. And so I will reply in English. Common decency would have been appropriate.
The first caravan of Central and South American migrants seeking asylum in the United States has arrived at the border city of Tijuana. The group of 400 people broke away from the larger caravan of 5,000 in Mexico City. Larger groups are expected to reach the border in the coming days. U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis was due to visit the border on Wednesday, his first trip since thousands of American troops were deployed there. U.S. authorities also closed down several lanes of traffic at two border crossings from Tijuana to California on Tuesday so that soldiers can install barbed wire fencing and barricades. President Trump signed a decree last Friday that effectively suspended the granting of asylum for those who cross the border illegally, a move that could drastically slow claims at gates of entry.
Good morning. The college entrance exam is well underway, but students in the western regions had a dusty morning, and it's likely to get dustier as the day goes on. Meanwhile, Beijing was smothered by the worst smog so far this year, seeing levels 12 times higher than the average healthy exposure level over a 24-hour period. And that's going to add to the levels of fine dust here in the Korean Peninsula as well. And temperatures for today overall will not be too bad. We had a chilly start, but readings will rise rapidly as the day goes on, so be aware of big temperature differences and dress in layers so that you can just take them off if you get too warm in the afternoon. And daily highs will range between 13 and 18 degrees Celsius. Seoul and Daejeon will get up to 15 degrees, Daegu topping out at 16 degrees. That's Korea for you, and here's international weather for viewers around the world.
Well, that's where we're going to have to leave it for now on this Thursday morning here in Seoul. Do stay tuned to Arirang TV. Plenty more coming up, including our next newscast at noon Korea time with our very own Lee Ji-yoon. So until then, goodbye.